So welcome everybody to this evening seminar, You Can't Sit With Us, Austen's Lady Karens and the British Slave Trade, which will be given by our speaker, Trey Ventle-Griffiths. So economic historians would describe absentee enslavers as people who managed enslaved people and the land they toiled on, while geographically and psychologically removed from the terror of the plantation. Based on Trey's chapter in the upcoming book, Jane Austen and the Makings of Regency Whiteness, this seminar uses Jane Austen's adaptations to refrain Austen's women as absentee enslavers or in close association with that brutal system thousands of miles away. Focused on the erasure of absentee enslavement from Regency romance, it provides a richer discussion largely absent from spaces like English literature and Austen studies. With 40% of compensation claims being women, characters like Emma Woodhouse may also allegorise the lives of women from landed families in the records, especially as 29 National Trust properties are tied to successful claims. So this seminar will illustrate those links between empire and Austen's characters on screen. Trey Ventle-Griffiths is a multiply disabled historian, creative writer and sociologist with interests in Black histories, race and disability, pop culture and insurgent politics. His PhD research, which he's in the final stages of finishing up, uses creative storytelling methods to consider a multi-generational story of Caribbean Northamptonshire after 1942. Trey's work is popular culture, looks at representation, identity, and political commentaries in the history, writing, and development of popular entertainment, namely comics, film, and TV. And at the moment, one of his projects uses Marvel media to develop new theories around microaggressions and other forms of social harm. Trey has written and presented on work including Regency romance, Greta Gerwig's Barbie, Peaky Blinders, superhero films, and the Disney princess phenomenon. So lots for us to ask him, I think, in the questions session later. Trey is also a member of the Centre for the History of People, Place and Communities Advisory Boards. And this event is part of the IHR's People, Place and Community Seminar Series hosted by the Centre. The Centre fosters engaged, innovative research into placed histories across all regions and periods, from the rural to the urban and the parish and the metropolis, with an emphasis on the localised, the micro-historical and the site-specific. It also works together with others to develop imaginative new approaches to making history and to identify opportunities for history to make a difference in the real world today. You may have heard of the Centre's two flagship projects, the Victoria County History, a national network of place-based history, and Layers of London, a digital resource providing access to historical maps of London and opportunities for members of the public to share knowledge about specific places in London. The centre is positioned in the Institute of Historical Research, which is a physical place in London, but also a global community dedicated to participating in, supporting and engaging everyone in the process of making history. So with no further ado, I'm now going to pass over to Trey, who's got some slides to share. So over to you, Trey.
Thanks for that. It works. Can we see that?
Yeah, it's looking good. You just need to put it into the full screen mode.
Okay. So evening, everyone. Welcome to my paper, You Can't Sit With Us, Austen's Lady Karens and Britain's Slave Trade. So this paper is actually split into two bits. The first half is like a history-ish paper, and then which I did for the Society of Caribbean Studies Postgraduate Research Conference early this year. And then the second half has been adapted from an upcoming conference paper as well. I'm doing, I guess, a Ghost Studies Symposium in Ireland at the end of this month. And it basically extends the history elements into my personal experiences of heritage, Austen, and also ghosts, and where we might find echoes of Jane Austen's, I guess, colonial afterlife on rural estates today, so heritage sites and so forth. Today's paper is also based on a forthcoming book chapter from historians Dr. Sinanan and Dr. Jane Osborne's Jane Austen, and the Making of Regency Whiteness. Um, it's something I was first thinking about really, actually several years ago, back in 2019, when I was a student union sabbatical officer for Northampton Students' Union attached to the University of Northampton. And I was witnessing the ways white women maneuvered themselves at my local university and also local Northampton liberal arts spaces as well. At that time, I was already writing on period dramas. So things like the BBC adaptation of Poldark, for example, based on the novels by Winston Graham. And I was aware of how Black people in the liberal arts were also being abused by white women co-workers as well. And around that time as well, I became aware of historians Stephanie E. Jones Rogers and Hannah Young's work, their work about gender and enslavement in Britain and the United States. So I began to think about what if that logic was applied to, the space of UK institutions. Ruby Hamad did a good job exposing this in White Tears, Brown Scars. And then I went back to my realm of film. So for many people of my generation as well, of cusp millennials, the 2004 film Mean Girls does not need an introduction. And it's where my paper, the first half of my paper title gets its name. It's a film that has impacted youth consciousness in ways few YA films have. So the cattiness, the viral forms of manipulation, the psychological warfare we see is one we know from workplaces and spaces as well. The plastics, as they're called in the film, are written as aspiration within an American high school, in similar ways to Jane Austen's women are seen as the aspiration winning at capitalism in Regency England, which enables them to escape into the countryside. So watching these adaptations, often thought about these characters as the mean girls that we see imitations of in public and private. Although the term Karen then has been going much longer, it came to a peak in 2020 to describe middle-class white women who weaponized their racial and class privilege against those racialized outside of whiteness. In recent times, though, I found it very problematic. In some cases, it has been co-opted to mean, basically, broadly speaking, any woman that someone might find vaguely annoying, which is a slippery slope into misogyny when its origins speak to a distinct type of white womanhood. Um, in Austen, this might take a different dimension as well, as these are stories where people that look like myself are largely absent. So what does this look like in white spaces? As in iterations of Emma, for example, the scene when the wealthy Emma Woodhouse mocks the poor Miss Bates is important because it shows where class exposes itself as something that is codified differently for different groups of white people. Miss Bates is poor, namely lower middle class in Austen's context, and Emma is exceedingly wealthy. She does not like Miss Bates's lack of social consequence. Scholars who write about whiteness and class show how in Austen there are other readings that are possible. Class is not added on top of, but allows white folks to split themselves even from other white people. So it codifies whiteness differently for different groups read as white. Furthermore, as Georgiana Lamb in Sanditon, despite being an heiress worth £100,000, will never be white enough for Lady Denham. So Austen's Lady Karens in this world may come in very different guises, and obviously this is open to discussion as well. So a sociology reading might say some white women are whiter than others, some aren't white enough. In her article, Whiteness on the Couch, then, psychologist Natasha Stovall points out that whiteness and white identities does not move tidily. In her own words, she says, what is whiteness and which one? Farm to table white or cracker barrel white? Rust belt white or sunbelt white? Electric car white or pickup truck white? Digital white or analog white? 1% honky or precariat au fait? Italian, Irish, English, Ukrainian, Polish. As far as England, then, I would say Amelia de Moldenberg white, Lucian Yak or Superdry white, Made in Chelsea or Towie, Phoebe Waller-Bridge, The Catherine Tate Show or The Crown, public pumpkin spice latte or matcha tea white. And while these caricatures are by no means based on rigorous, academic research, but more like comic observation, they are metaphors for the many types of white womanhood in society, and that not all white women experience whiteness equally. So thinking about white women as absentees, then Jane Austen's novels and subsequent adaptations um, are known for their sharp dialogue, memorable wit, and characters, and commentaries of early 19th century societal norms focused on white women's love lives and preoccupations with extreme wealth, marriage, and social standing. The place of colonization, enslavement, and empire is not as popular as one might expect. Edward Said made an intervention back in the 90s, cultural imperialism, and then later on in The Pen and the Sword, thinking about Mansfield Park and absentee slave ownership. Um, Although Jane's novels enlarged did not wide-scale commentate on the links between white escapism into the country estate and slave ownership, this is where adaptation could have expanded but chose to blindly follow the canon, basically. Corinne Fowler's book as well, The Green and Pleasant Land, explores some of this starting in Britain and then going out towards empire, showing that it's not only about the economics, but showing how the countryside has a long-standing black presence as well. Austen's unfinished novel Sanditon, or what became ITV Sanditon, for example, goes as far as having black characters, but falls short of those economic debates. What often gets missed is how white escapism in these programs and the source material is upheld by colonial violence exported off screen or out of text in that sense. To invoke Walter Rodney as well, colonialism was not just a violence, but a process whose main purpose was to inject profit into Britain. The underdevelopment of Africa was dependent on the development of Europe. Michel Rolfe-Trio also talked about historical production as well, and I think this is a great time to think about how many people's um, introduction to wealthy white women aristocrats is not actually through academic books. White women are everywhere in Austen and nowhere. So if your first exposure to the Regency is in period dramas, you probably inherited a narrative of carefree and blameless white women, playing second fiddle to white men as background, as passive observers, as benevolent allies, while their relationship to black people, brown people, and other people of color in many cases was a lot more sinister. So before I found academia, then I was a child watching period dramas. I went to school in a village and spent a lot of time around village cricket clubs and war memorials and country houses, and really things attached to England's ideas of nationhood and nation. Or learning these places were solidifying ideas of social hierarchy and class. Austen's women are part of that history. So to consider some as absentees then challenges how Austen is imagined in the public imagination as comfort. So we see this in Mansfield Park, following the working class Annie Price sent to live with her wealthy aunt and uncle on a Northamptonshire estate that lives dependent on an Antiguan sugar plantation. And then UCL's 10-year project, where they digitized the slave compensation records as well, holds the keys for better, I guess, more anti-racist Austen, if that's possible. It holds records for thousands of slave owners and their claims, successful and unsuccessful claims. It talks about women like Catherine Anderson, who was awarded around just over £5,000 for the loss of 187 enslaved people, so property. Yet compared to Emma Woodhouse in Emma, 5,000 is really a pittance sum. In Emma is described as clever and rich, bringing in a personal fortune of £30,000, but we are never told the origins of the Woodhouse fortune. Screen adaptations really obscure these facts. Historian Hannah Young's PhD as well looked at the links between gender, property, and power, showing how both men and women played important roles in the transfer of slave-based wealth into Britain. One point of her thesis was showing the ways women benefited. And for characters like Lizzie Bennet in Pride and Prejudice, for example, her story could be expanded into marriage into wealth. Other readings may be that her husband, Mr. Darcy, acquired his wealth as an absentee slave owner. He is worth some 200,000, or some historians estimate the 1% in the years that Pride is set were worth 100,000. So he is exceedingly wealthy in that sense. Darcy is answerable to his auntie, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, who inherited her money and estate from her dead husband, and lives at the picturesque Rosings Park. The De Bourgh holdings may be too slave related. Again, this is an interpretation. So as a character, she is basically a total schemer, and very savvy at getting what she wants. Very comparable to someone like the life of Lady Anne Eliza Bridges. So in Britain's Forgotten Slave Owners, Hannah Young reads from the letters and tells us that Bridges is incredibly wealthy, incredibly knowledgeable about plantation ownership, and is very assertive about what she wants doing on the plantation. For example, she orders the sugarcane trenches are to be dug crosswise rather than perpendicular. She is particularly keen to ensure there's a fresh manure to improve the quality of the soil. I'm extremely concerned at the death of the Negro Bacchus, Bridges also writes. The reason she is so concerned is because he is essential in the still house, and she hopes his loss isn't irreplaceable. Bridges is not actually concerned about the loss of life. It's not an emotional loss, but it's basically the loss of resources. The economics of the slave compensation records illustrate how 20 years after Austen's heyday, the characters in those stories were probably lining up in London to stake their claim. It is within that, I guess, destructive history that the records show that other readings are possible of Austen's work. Earlier romance texts as well, like Tom Jones, which was adapted in 2022, gives another example with Lady Bellaston, who was independently wealthy and unexplainably wealthy, conveniently in that show in the 1740s. Amo Sante's Belle, set in the 1780s, also writes white women as almost just annoyingly racist, but somehow allies, but ultimately support the white men. It was a missed opportunity, I think, for me to think about how women oppressed by patriarchy did not give two hoots, basically, about owning enslaved people, and participating, I guess, in receiving the profits from colonized labor. Gender-only analysis dominates fandom discussions as well in Jane Austen, I guess, online Facebook groups and things like that, upholding a culture set on keeping colonialism and empire out of Austen. White women's escapism and that carefree life is readable through the colonial terror happening in the Caribbean. In Ang Lee's Sense and Sensibility, then, Marianne Dashwood is saved by Colonel Brandon after getting lost in the rain, developing a serious illness in the backdrop of the rural made by enslavement in the Caribbean. Black walkers at those sites, so stately homes and so forth, wander the ground that period dramas are now used as film sets. Christina Sharp's book as well, In the Wake, explores the enduring impact of enslavement on Black life, using the idea of the wake to see how Black life is shaped in a world where its colonial logic never left. So Black walkers in rural Britain are situated in Jane Austen's colonial afterlife, where rural estates with a big house in the middle imitate the rural Caribbean, a big house surrounded by plantations. Stately homes today in Jane's afterlife would also mean to take racism not only as a physical project, but a spiritual one as well. These sites filled with the wide rooms, lakes, tall ceilings, and white women portraits come to show how these spaces were made, who they were made by, and who for. Georgiana in Sanditon speaks to this, where she sees that even with £100,000, her spirit doesn't take to these people and these spaces. Fortune hunters, she calls them. There is also Lady Susan, who is independently and also unexplainably wealthy in Sanditon, as well. But equally, with a historical lens, you cannot tell me that these women gained their wealth ethically as well. So the UCL records gives a researched backstory to what we see in art and popular culture. Some of these women were outright enslavers. Some inherited it. Some were dependent on the system through male relatives. It went from the lower middle class to aristocrats, and it shows us that they enjoyed the life empire bought. In many ways, this is the contrast between Jane Austen's work and maybe someone like Charles Dickens, someone like Charles Dickens, where a reading of Oliver Twist, for example, where we're not told how Oliver's grandfather, Mr. Brownlow, made his money. We are told he's rich and he adopts Oliver at the end of the story, but taking his age as an elder in the 1830s and 40s, when that story is set, it's possible he got his money through absentee enslavement as a young man, which contrasts to the story's themes against the workhouse and the exploitation of children as well. So poor, in Jane Austen's terms, really just means lower middle class, and that's how I read it. Um, and so someone like Miss Bates is lower middle class. Austen's poor is not Charles Dickens' poor. So it's relative, which is why I can't take any of these people seriously when they say this. Basically, you have to get a job. That's basically what they're saying, and it just irritates me half the time. But anyway, these white women oppressed by men, um, but also managing to escape based in a system of anti-black racism flies in the face of a narrative the media establishment want to produce. So through seeing what's not there, you begin to see how escapism is also whiteness, effectively. Yet we as consumers are told to suspend basically all our logical belief systems and everything we know in favor of a good story, effectively. Um, and those ideas of empire are relegated to the backdrop. In Austen's rural, then I see rural Grenada, where my family are from. So every estate, I dream of my ancestors. I'm colonizer and colonized. As also nearly 30 national trust properties are linked to successful claims for compensation. Um, there are other ways to tell stories of the slave trade, which is also black genocide as well. Chattel enslavement is genocide. So the tropes of period dramas clash with the vision the powerful have for history. A couple of years ago, I used the film Alex Garland's Men to think about how horror might be a way to bring the compensation records to life. In Men, we have Jessie Buckley's character Harper Marlowe fleeing a domestic abuse situation in London, and she flees to a country house. I think it's in Hertfordshire as an escape, only to find Rory Kinnear's many faces of patriarchy waiting for her. Very much in the echo of James McAvoy in Split. So Rory Kinnear plays about 10 different characters in that film, basically saying the many shades of patriarchy, basically saying all men to varying degrees are the same. And that's what the film was about, effectively. But what if we made films about enslavement that way, about whiteness that way in England? So using horror to talk about the history of the private sector would give teeth to Austen's white women as slave owners. So I think other readings are possible there, and it takes a bit of imagination. The creative element mixed with the academic element. So the next part of this paper takes that historical discussion of Austen and really seeks to offer a possible, I guess, theoretical step a little bit. So in 2023, I started a project, a bit of a side quest to my PhD, thinking about how white supremacy and whiteness operates not only intersectionally, but also through things like time, reality, and things that can't be perceived ordinarily with the human senses, a bit like 4D chess. And it draws on people like Charles Mills's term, like racial time, where time manipulates how we experience racism, for example. But that spate of work was also grounded in Stuart Hall and his ideas of low theory, finding meaning in popular places, alongside scholars like from queer and cultural studies, Elizabeth Freeman, Lauren Ballant, and Jack Halberstam as well. So I thought about the horror of country houses, which then you can begin to connect to Austen and I guess the colonial poltergeists in the basement. So what spirits lurk in the corners, and the white ladies of the lake that go bump through country estates and the trees and the fields and so on, and that expansiveness as the holders of truths held in the blood of things like checkbooks and invoices and bank statements, these very physical things. Um, so, um, so philosopher Jacques Derrida used the term hauntology to describe the time-transcending battles or abilities of Marxism to haunt the global West beyond the grave. It's in his debate of Karl Marx and that a spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism, that Derrida invokes Shakespeare's phrase, the time is out of joint, also arguing there is no historical origin of any point, but an always already absent present. And to be fair, I found his book very, very confusing. I found it quite inaccessible and not written for people, I guess, that are wanting to learn from outside of the academy. But I think he was writing for an academic readership in mind. In many ways, there have been writers before and after Derrida I found infinitely easier to follow, including Toni Morrison and Alice Walker, and several of the black feminists from the 80s and 90s. Hamlet's claim that time is out of joint was useful for thinking about how country estates as film sets For Austen adaptations, as well as Regency reenactments with the costumes, keep that performance of empire alive and kicking, celebrating that what empire prophets gave. It shows time is out of joint, quite literally, with the ghost of Austen in the present, um, through things like Bridgerton parties, for example. Um, Albert Einstein called time nothing more than a persistent, stubborn illusion. Um, and then physicist Sabine Hossenfelder writes about a block universe where ideas are past, present, and future exist similarly. Ultimately, this scientific conceptualization of time challenges how historians teach history as the study of the past, distinct from the now and the future. So, thinking about this white women, racism, and history, might the experiences of Black folks be in conversation with this block universe where empire on these country estates never actually really died in that sense? Um, might country houses be haunted? What lurks in the shadows? So, taking these grand estates, its symbology as film sets for these stories, it leaves space to commentate on the silences. In March 2024, I presented at Historic England's Wellbeing and Heritage Conference at my local heritage site, Delapre Abbey in Northampton. My paper was about how white heritage staff can act like police officers against Black staff and visitors, very much in the ethos of rural estates, basically as open air prison. Think about Foucault and the prison effectively, but dumping that whole logic on, on rural estates. Sociologist Denise Noble also replied to me when I tweeted about this, saying, "I'm pleased you are giving visibility to this phenomenon, that it's so pervasive. I can't forget the white woman at Windsor Abbey," and I think she's talking about Windsor Castle here. It turns to me, my friend and our 4 children, and angrily belched, "What are you doing here?" I hope she surprised herself with her visceral repulsion. So in these, I guess, these white on black crimes, is Jane Austen's time and our time melding? Is time to invoke Hamlet out of joint? So now programs like Bridgerton then have continued with that tradition, with the balls and the Regency culture and the costumes and so on, and how fans have taken up this mantle with their own parties. So the empire is always being performed. So that war on narrative is still being fought. In 2025, the Nottoway plantation in Louisiana burnt to death. Um, Academic Dr. Mia Crawford Johnson's selfie comes back to my friend, literary scholar Rene Landell's assertion that symbolic power is power. Dr. Wren talked about this in an Al Jazeera broadcast back in 2022, when several Caribbean islands were asserting their right to cut ties with the monarchy. And the burning of Nottoway and that selfie as symbolic is an affront to empire everywhere. It's the photo finish that takes the radical rest our ancestors never could. And I want to leave that bit there, but I think you should, if you're interested in stuff like that, you should go and look at the original Instagram post on her Instagram channel, because I found it really interesting as a point. Because people want to protect these places, but I don't think there's anything to protect for me anyway. But my ancestors were colonized by these people, so I'm not objective here. But yeah, in her paper, Colonial White Womanhood, Persuasion and Its Afterlives, Kerry Sinanan, I mentioned earlier, historian and literary scholar, makes several arguments, including Austen's works are representations of everyday imperial white supremacy. She thinks Austen's works with an on-screen pop cultural, she calls it a novelistic refictioning of Austen right now for her 250th birthday. But Austen is reimagines to embody all that makes Britain great. Kerry throws up Jane Austen, The Rise of a Genius, which is now on iPlayer. I watched it, and it's just imperial nostalgia. I'd probably tell everyone else to watch it as well, so they can suffer just like I did. And it's something that will gather celebrities to reanimate Austen's ghost and how great she was. This is very close to COVID-19 Britain, where former Prime Minister Boris Johnson was comparing lockdown to the Blitz. Many of you will remember that. Austen to this strain of white women, then, I think to me, is what Winston Churchill is, and the war is to many, to this certain strain of white men, and that are empowered by that whole narrative. So that is particularly important now as marketing for her forthcoming 250th birthday is happening, and especially in Bath as well. Carrie lived in Bristol for many years, and remarks how you will see mainly cisgender straight presenting white women, gendered bodies dressed in muslin, Regency costumes, and parades of red coats as there was last year. It's imperial nostalgia as performance art. Um, Austen is a cultural vehicle and really gets away with it because these stories are just nice and cozy and non-confrontational. Kerry is also from Trinidad. She's Trinidadian Irish and has a natural disposition against this kind of imperial nostalgia, cultural violence, basically. For me, I also agree with that assertion. Since my own background with grandparents from the Caribbean, so Jamaica and Grenada, and their histories, I also have a family history of being involved in slave rebellions. So my family were involved in the Fading Rebellion in Grenada in 1795. And my talk today is influenced by that position. So Dress Up, bringing Jane Austen's ghost back. Dress Up becomes a host for, I guess, whiteness as this parasitic process to attach itself to. Victorian Britain gets to live again, basically, through performance. So we go back to Nottoway and that dying of whiteness, but it can never die really because we can't give it up. The celebrations, the nostalgia, on the brink of death, but never actually experiencing death because we keep bringing it back from the grave in that sense. But worse, sociologist Calvin Powell and Holly Henderson tell us the biggest beneficiary of university gender equality framework, Athena Swan, is also white women. While Jesse Daniels says that white women in the US won EDI and have more in common with white men than they do with other women of color. Now, UK heritage is reportedly 66% women and 90% white, so we can also do the math there as well. Although heritage hits many areas beyond country estates, these are places where the shape of white womanhood is operating in the here and the now, and also back then. So thinking about that idea of the block universe and the countryside, where ideas of past and present are similar. So those distinctions between nowness and unnowness, past and present, is the very nature of ghostiness. It's a study in phantoms. So walking around these places and seeing the results of enslaved labor. I'm brought back to the rural Caribbean, where my own family are from. My family were farmers, and they were green-fingered folk. My great-grandmother, Agatha Sita, Nensita Vental, was a farmer and a market trader, and she never left Grenada. While my other great-grandparents, Toyley and Benmark Noel, came to Northampton in 1962. They were from the village. They were village people from Granroy in St. John Parish, while Sita was from a place called Borleo in St. George Parish in Grenada, and she came to Granroy when she was 16 in 1927. You'd think that what has Austen possibly got to do with my family history, and absolutely everything. We're taking white women as these absentee slave owners. So the ancestors of the Ventals and the Noels were probably on the other side of that history. And through my PhD, I found doing interviews with many local people in Northampton and in Wellingborough as well. So many people can tell family histories of farming and land in the Caribbean. Yet, rural spaces in Britain are often seen as areas of escape. In Northamptonshire, this is seen with white families using sites like Delapre Abbey to forget their troubles. So the English rural is really seen in that idea of horror and terror and violence. For children that grew up in the rural Caribbean, many were an extra pair of hands to work, but many were also allowed to be children. My older cousin Weeks saw Northampton as a vastly different place to rural Grenada. He was raised by his grandmother, and while he left Northampton town, he also told me that as a family, we never had a fridge. As a family, we never had a cooker. Everything was organic, so the sea provided the fish, the land provided the food. It was us going into the field, the allotment, the bush, whatever you want to call it. And we just took what was provided, whether it was banana, sweet potato, yam, plantain, you name it. It was there. We came home, prepared it, and we ate it. Things like chicken was killed and prepared, fish was netted and prepared. As a kid growing up in Northampton, these are things we would never have done. Bearing in mind we never had any electricity, so everything we ate was with a kerosene lamp. But if you lived there, it would have been normal, he told me. So yeah, so you got the British rural opposite the Caribbean rural, and what we've got there is like a study in greenwashing in that sense. For Weeks' ancestors, my ancestors probably built places like Althorpe House, for an example, which is another one that's local to me. Again, siblings, Ron Frater and Marcia Walker, talked to me about their grandparents. Until she was 6 years old, Marcia lived in a place called Duckenfield with her parents before going to Hampton Court, St. Thomas, Jamaica, to live with her maternal grandparents, Alexander Nesbith and Francesca McDowell. Um, Growing up at Hampton Court, the place she left as a child was not one of cityscapes and tower blocks, but of countryside. On Wednesday, she helped her grandmother grate coconut. It was on Friday nights, Francesca took the coconut oil to sell in the village and to market on Saturday. So similar to my great grandmother, Sita as well in Grenada. Um, Alexander Nesbith he wasn't a black man. He was what they called Assyrian. And one remembers their grandfather being fair skinned with wavy hair. And he recounted how the Nesbiths made their money through loan sharking. And when poorer people couldn't pay what they owed, they took the equivalent in land. And to be honest, the Nesbith story is very medieval. It's very Austen in its brutality, except Austen exports that sort of violence to the Caribbean and the Americas. So Alexander Nesbith and his brothers were also involved in the dredging of Gatun Lake in Panama, and one of the brothers was reportedly killed in a flood as well. So through these oral histories of those now dubbed the Windrush generation, um, there are phantoms of the slave trade. Austen and the stories of many of her contemporaries are perfect sites to track the ghosts and echoes of that absentee slave ownership. Places that we now call bush in the Caribbean cast that long shadow over Austen's countryside. It places us into the fields of the past and back again. In Austen's world of money and property, there is a phantasmic history of properties produced by my kin as metaphor as well. So those houses are metaphors, I guess, for the clitter-clatter of bones, the flicker of a flame or a warm casket. There are midnight meetings in the death of a place is there and not there-ness, and there's shells of memories of an old house and corpses like a hollow auditorium. In stately homes, as slave properties, there are shadow memories, trauma, trauma like a graveyard of teeth, as a history of phantoms, where the rural estate mirrors that landscape in the Caribbean, a history of phantoms, ghosts, spectres, and poltergeists in the British countryside. In The Alchemy of Race and Rights as well, Patricia Williams also says that her 2 times great grandmother was enslaved by a Tennessee lawyer called Austin Miller, who fathered her children through rape and sexual exploitation. American plantations imitate the rural estate as well, the British rural estate, a big house surrounded by plantation, greenwashing. So as Black walkers wander those areas today, we might hear those poltergeists in the basement and phantoms in the fields. The paintings might move. Walking around those places, I don't know if I am hearing things, but I feel energy there. I'm back in the countryside in Grenada, where I visited the family graves, which are on the family land, basically the back garden. And I began to consider how my ancestors were helped into those graves by the economics, like those we see in Austen films and novels and so on. It's that boomerang effect of empire going to the Caribbean, to Africa, to England, and back again. So thinking about Austen like an apparition across time, the lady vanishes and then she's back again. So Patricia Williams being in conversation with her 2 times great grandmother and finding the ghosts of enslavement in the US census records shows us how to study silence. To study silence is to study ghosts effectively, and that's what's there as much as what isn't there. The country house is full of silences, the blood spatter on the walls without a body, and the evidence locker without a crime scene. The compensation records show how archives render the voices of enslaved people ghostly. We see the claims of the mostly white slave owners, sometimes where they lived, but never the voices of the enslaved. Sadia Hartman talks about the challenges of finding the human of Black people in slave archives that focus on status as property. Could it be that analysing white women on these estates, we see the ghosts of Austen's characters and the places she wrote about made escapable by those prophets? Hartman contends with the ways the arts can lift the spirits, animating the groans and cries of the enslaved from the erasure imposed upon those who wrote the history books. My family name shows up in the records. I could not find the human, but I found records of accounts and evidence to how nearly half of all claims were made by women, predominantly white women, like those in Austen's stories? Is Austen and the country house to white women what Churchill and the Blitz is to many white men? Um, do these symbols empower a certain type of white belonging? I come back to Denise's tweet about Windsor Castle and how white women on these sites may be empowered to police others, and they don't police others they don't feel should be there. An apparition, maybe. Um, so haunting is alive, is to live with the ghosts, both real and imagined, including of whiteness's eternal. For the worlds Austen is set in and the space country estates occupy, haunting harbours a violence that takes these spaces out of a utopian fantasy and escapism into fantasies of horror and the macabre, and that radiates sort of white supremacist, that feeling through your body, thought and essence, and ghosts that are as real as they are mythological, that live in buildings, in the walls. There are unseen dangers for Black people there, in the image of ancestors, occupying spaces that are alive, living, kicking. Mainly for myself, I started to refer to this feeling as anthropomorphic whiteness to give language to how historical objects like buildings may take on human traits. That's something I first learned about in school English literature classes on poetry, and then later on when I began my career as a performance poet as well. So anthropomorphism as a literary device where we can give the non-human human traits. So that term is basically English literature meets sociology, critical whiteness studies. Um, so in 1955, there was a French philosopher called Guy Debord who popularized the term psychogeography. He described the study of the special effects of the geographic environment on the emotions and behavior of individuals. For those estates seen as sites of white women's belonging, the place of absentee slave owners would also be one tied up in the land. An Austen haunting told from the Black gaze, or Black or otherwise not white gaze, would turn those spaces and places into not only like a Black British psychogeography, but also a Black British haunting as well. The present is always intruded upon by an ever restless past. So for white women who may see these spaces as part of their self, psychogeography is useful for making the links between whiteness, gender, and space, used to harm people of color. Writing empire back into Austen would take a turn where to write enslavement back into those locations, the film sets, would be to admit the real places have our ancestors' blood on it as well. So there lies like, the delinking of fiction from reality, and sort of the mixing of the two as well. What is real and what is not. But they feed on each other like a snake, devouring its own tail in that sense. Austen's stories cannot have it both ways. Arguably, texts that support a certain type of womanhood, and really a white womanhood, let's be honest, but also having that womanhood dependent on the exploitation of Black people, brown people, and other forms of colonized labor off screen. What we have is a capitalist white feminism, fully part of a culture of white supremacy, dependent on an order of things that sorts and stacks people into groups. To abolish enslavement, Austen is intimately connected with those structures of inheritance and bloodlines, and who gets what property and so on, that we see on screen and in the books, and in the stories of many of her colleagues as well. Very much in Ruth Wilson Gilmore's definition. So there's no Austen without Black death. Like to have Austen and the properties there, Black people in the Caribbean have to die on those plantations, as bleak as that sounds as well. But that was the nature of slavery. Enslavement is genocide. So using hauntology then, and ghost studies, to animate the country house and the slave compensation records will be a novel approach and open a conversation that cannot be quantified in the usual ways, because we're taking the unseen feeling. So anthropomorphic whiteness gives a language to the way in which the terror of colonial history is embedded in objects, in present day objects, living in the present. How do objects become charged with whiteness or white racism? Castles, churches, statues, shows like Doctor Who are a visual motivation, I think, where the weeping angels make me think about how we might tell stories where the statues of the estate come to life and the people of the house are forced to confront a woe of their own making. The angels don't move when you're looking at them, and then you look away, and then what happens when you blink, effectively. And that's whiteness for me, in a nutshell. Um, so in Austen's afterlife, um, psychogeography is relevant to making the links between rural estates, whiteness, and the emotions. My friend geographer Rihanna Garrett did her PhD, and it was called The Architecture of Whiteness, and explored this in the context of university campuses and that physical terrain, architecture as a metaphor, in the same way as whiteness as a time transcending, reality bending mode of violence, may be explained by the metaphor of a multiverse. So, that idea of many worlds and many whitenesses. So, that soul sucking nature of university campuses is something that my other friend, Iman Khan, is exploring in her PhD on the student experiences at Loughborough University. And the spaces white women take up in Austen's afterlife in that shadow of empire, as much as it is to ask if Jane ever really died, because we keep having Bridgerton parties, the street art, the imperial art, the street performance, and so on. So now with her 250th birthday looming, the way her memory is being reproduced is to see the countryside in Britain, I guess, in that murmur of empire. White women taking up spaces their ancestors would have. So that apparition of whiteness, like a ghost. What happens if you look away? What happens when you blink? And that's basically the end of my presentation. It was two papers put together, and I hope it was interesting. And if anyone's got questions, I'm happy to answer any questions as well. And again, if you like this sort of thing, I do this sort of all the time, mixing history and politics with popular culture, comics, superhero movies, Barbie, and all that stuff. But yeah, thanks very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Trey. That was absolutely wonderful. I don't know if you want to stop sharing your screen and then we can kind of all see a few more faces. But now is the time for questions. So if anybody has any questions, please do put them in the chat or use the raise hand function. But I'd just like to firstly say, Trey, thank you so much for what was actually a really personal and kind of open set of reflections on your behalf, a really brave set of reflections, I think. Using Austen's adaptations as a kind of starting point for really engaging with such an expansive range of conversations about the British countryside and the country house as the kind of the scene of a ghost story and horror stories. I think that kind of the way in which you engage with culture in that way provides a really accessible moment to have these difficult conversations. So thank you so much. And I mean, there's so much there that I could kind of open up, but maybe while people are thinking through their questions and formulating questions, what really struck with me as one of the co-general editors of the Victoria County History, which is really often, not always, but often engaging with the kind of rural histories, is the kind of broader implications of what you're saying about the countryside as a space full of ghosts and full of horror narratives. And there have been times in the past where we've sort of jokingly talked about ways in which we could tell VCH ghost stories, but it would be super interesting to have some conversations with you about, you know, how the VCH unpicks those ghosts that are within those rural narratives that it's talking about, and the research that's been done, and how to start kind of thinking about how to tell those narratives in an effective way.
Yeah, I think there's definitely space for that, and like even something as basic as a ghost tour of a country house might be interest to people. But I know, like I mentioned in the paper, Toni Morrison, and she coined a term called rememory, and that could probably be applied to, I guess, Black experiences and Asian experiences of going to a country estate. Like you may not have experienced something traumatic there, but your ancestors might have done, and what you're experiencing is what your ancestors experienced. And it's sort of like that. It's that secondhand trauma. I think they call it. I think psychologists would call it vicarious trauma, um, or historical trauma as well. But I think the stuff with the ghosts and the country estates, it's on one side you've got the really arty side of it, which is interesting. But on the other side of it, yeah, ghosts can sort of just embed themselves in your spirit and leave you feeling off for weeks and months. So when I talk about ghosts and whiteness, I'm talking about, like, I guess, the whiteness of death in that sense. So you go to a country house, you don't know why you feel weird, but you know something's off. And yeah, I think Gen Z would say the vibe, there's just bad vibes. So the bad vibes are off. So you go there. So I think, yeah. So yeah, I think country houses, it's a conversation to be had. But how you have it is going to be another one completely, because you've got to convince people that, to some extent, spirituality, ghosts and spirituality is something to be entertained in this way. But because of how the West has demonized a lot of this sort of stuff, you can have a hard job convincing certain aspects of academia as well, especially, that this is worth pursuing. So I'd say yes. I think whiteness and ghosts is a whole another rabbit hole, and then the ghost tours are another rabbit hole. But I know in Northampton there's ghost tours at the Royal Gate Theatre that they do. They do tours for people that go in there. But Northamptonshire as a county, it's everywhere you go, you'll find something that's off about it, like ghost tours and things like that. So I think, yeah, yeah, I think it's a conversation to be had. But how you have it, I don't know. I don't have the answers. I'm sorry, I don't have the answers. But I'm interested. If anyone's got thoughts on this, I'm happy to have that conversation.
Yeah, definitely. Please do add things in the chat or raise your hand if there's something that you want to contribute to. Oh, Ola Tunde, are you raising your hand? Would you like to speak? Oh, you're muted. Let me see if I can ask you to unmute, but I can't unmute you myself. It might have been the way that you joined, that you might not have use of your microphone. I'll give you a second to just see if you can unmute yourself. While you're doing that, Morag has put something in the chat. Mora Cross, would you rewrite a new version of Austen to include things you feel she should have examined, like slaveholders' economics?
I don't know, actually. Sometimes I don't like putting modern day sensibilities on historical things to some extent. Even though I know there were people talking about that at the time. And I'm sure Satnam Sankara's Empire Land talks about the people that were anti all of that slavery stuff as well. But I'm not sure I would want to impose that on Austen. But I think I'm more interested in the adaptations, because there's a lot of TV and film people that they take creative license when it suits them, and when it doesn't suit them, they don't do it. So I think, like, the novels are fixed, the novels are what they are, and so on. But the films and the TV shows are still being made, and the theatre shows are still being made. And creative writers could take a license if they really wanted to, but they don't most of the time, and they really should. Which is why I liked Sanditon. The first season of Sanditon, I think, took some of that license, and then second season and the third season they were cowards again. So and then also shows like The Confessions of Franny Langton as well. I think the novel was by Sarah Collins. And again, I think that does what I want Austen to do to some extent. But yeah, I don't think I would want to do that for the novels at least. But yeah, there's writers of that time that were talking about economics and slavery and things like that.
I believe Olatunde is ready to ask a question.
I am ready. Sorry, I don't know if it's answering a question, but a kind of comment really. I'm sat in my car in the Sainsbury's car park because I couldn't get home in time to watch it where I normally would see a webinar. So I'm glad to see it, Trey, and I'm glad I stopped in time to do this. But I think just what you're talking about, the kind of country houses, as somebody, who I like to go camping, you've got black children, like to take them everywhere that we've got a right to be. But that whole thing about those ghosts, and I would equally say that those ghosts and that vibe that you're talking about is exactly the same when you go and visit museums. all those stolen artifacts, and I think they're the
Yeah,
spirits of our ancestors who are in there. So I can't go to those spaces without saying, when people say, "Oh, isn't it a beautiful building?" I'm like, no, no, it's not, because those buildings are dripping with the blood of our ancestors, and it's
yeah,
just trying to get that understood. And I think it's something that's, I'm quite gobby and I'm very and artistic, so I'll just say it as it is. And just going to those spaces and actually seeing how people behave. So when you're talking about that white woman who suddenly starts to police the spaces, you know, I've worked in the Tate Gallery, and it's a very similar kind of vibe where, you know, Black people don't attend the Tate because I think they feel like they're being watched all the time. And so that is there constantly. And I remember going to Scotland one time. It was a tartan shop. So, you know, my obvious thing was like, oh, I wonder if the tartan of our ancestors is here. And you could see people sort of shriveling the shop. I thought, well, this is our reality. This is not me just making a noise. This is our reality. We cannot go to these spaces, think, oh, this is very interesting heritage. And I think I just wanted to add to all the stuff, just the stuff about heritage and heritage sites. You know, it's about, and I think one of the things I've realized now, kind of when I walk around places, I don't mind going to medieval places. And it suddenly clicked why. Because this is before enslavement. This is before clothes. Thinking I can actually be in these buildings because it's not the same thing. So it's, yeah, I just really appreciated what you had to say, because you know we visit these places or we pay money to go to whatever National Trust things, but actually this is, you know, the kind of horror and the trauma um is part of our genetic makeup. I won't
yeah.
even say vicarious, it's actually inside of us as we walk into those spaces. So I just want to say, I'm so glad that I came, Trey. I'm so pleased to hear you talk about all these issues. And I hope that people actually listening today really think about what, anybody who's got a heritage role of any kind, what's the story that you're actually telling? And is it a sanitized version? Because it usually is. Anyway, that's me.
Oh,
I've got,
thanks.
and I found microphone on my settings because I don't know how to use Zoom on my phone, but now I've done it. So I just wanted to say something and support, you know, some of the stuff that you're bringing to this discussion, Trey.
Thanks very much. And I think as well, like it changed the game when I watched Sinners. I went to watch Sinners in the cinema, and it was like most people who watch that film and think it's fiction. And I was walking like cinema. That's not none of that is fiction. All of that is real. It's happened somewhere. Um, and it's American, so I think people in Britain will think, oh, this is not about us. It definitely is about us. I think the difference is that all those buildings like that in Britain, we call them museums, and art galleries and stately homes, and you can make a Sinners about Harewood House, for example, which is the one just outside of Leeds. And I know it's had a lot of press recently because David Harewood's portrait is in there and things like that. But you can make a whole thing about sinners and spirits, and there's like a million of these country houses around the country. But I'd say if anyone has not watched Sinners, go and watch Sinners, um, and then reapply what Sinners has been talking about to this.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Trey. I've not seen it, so that's
yeah,
going on my list. I can see that there's a whole load of people saying we should be watching this. And thank you also to Olatunde for showing your support for what Trey's been saying. I know that it's kind of the first time that Trey's talked about some of this stuff you were saying,
yeah.
wasn't it? So I think it's really great when people can kind of show their support for something that Trey's kind of shown a lot of courage to come and share with us today. While I wait for others to kind of ask questions, another thing that really struck out to me, Trey, when you were talking was really about how representation is not even not enough, but like not really appropriate potentially within these kind of period drama adaptations that you're talking about. And I just wanted to invite you maybe to share your thoughts on things like colorblind casting and the ways in which Black people are represented in things like Bridgerton, and what your thoughts on that are.
Well, I'll start with Bridgerton in the sense that like I'm too far gone now that I have to finish it, but I do not like it. So like I'm in it. I've watched every season that's come, and like I'm invested to it because I need to see how it ends. But also the program's racist. It's racist to the bones. And then the first season, the white woman character Daphne rapes her Black husband, and then doesn't talk, and it's never talked about again. And then also in the program, the way they do mixed relationships as well. basically if you're in a mixed couple, you need a white person to validate your relationship. So it's just it's that sort of stuff. But then that's in the MO of I guess Shonda Rhimes production. That it's not just Bridgerton that does that. Literally most of our programs do that. And also like it's a Hollywood thing as well, that when it comes to mixed romance, you don't see people in mixed romance without a white person involved in it. So if it's a black person, it'll be a black person and a white person, or there'll be an Indian person and a white person, or maybe a Vietnamese woman and a white man, maybe, or a Chinese woman and a white man. And it's the whole Hollywood thing that if it's a mixed romance, they need a white person, and it just irritates me because the world doesn't work like that. So like many of our friendship groups, you'll find mixed couples in the friendship group, and it'll be two people of color, and that's okay as well. And on that, I won't go any further detail with that because I wrote a journal article about it. So if anyone wants the journal article about it, send me a message and I'll send it to you. And it was on Bridgerton Hollywood and the right centering of mixed romance, basically. But so that was Bridgerton, and then Sanditon. I found it a bit better, the first season of Sanditon, because it sort of touched on the slavery and it touched on sort of the racism issues of the time, and it wrote Lady Denham as a Karen, basically. And then there was another one called Mr. Malcolm's List, which I do like that film, but also it sort of makes the slave owners black and Asian, and doesn't really address any of that stuff. So all the property and all the money and everything, they've got all the money and the property, but they don't really address where it came from or anything like that. So it's sort of like diversifying of the Regency that we're seeing playing out in real time. So a few years ago, there was a whole hashtag around why a period drama is so white. And then a few years passes, and then you got all these programs with black people and Asian people in period dramas, not addressing the underlying history. So I think that's what really irritates me about all of it. I do like the shows though. I like the storytelling, but they could be using that storytelling in a more, I guess, responsible way. I think would be the term for that. But yeah, like they're making all these shows, and they're not really saying anything. They're not doing anything provocative. They're doing everything that all the white people shows do. So, and I think Bridgerton was the one that put the nail in the coffin the most, because it had about 80 million views in its first month, which is obscene for any show. Like 80 million in a month for its first season, and the Twitter discourse was more entertaining than the program at the time. So there was that as well. And if I was just thinking, if they'd made a program like that addressed all the things that it should be addressing, and it still had the same engagement, it would have upset the establishment. So, and I think that's why they didn't, and I think that's why it didn't do that as well. But yeah, diversity. I'm not 100% in it. I think diversity works when you tell the backstories and everything like that, but not when you just make everyone black with no one's, like, it's just 2D. It's a show in 2D when it should be 4D. Basically, I think that's the best way I can describe it. But yeah, Bridgerton, Sanditon, Mr. Malcolm's List, then Amor Sante's film Belle. I used to like it. I don't like it anymore. I watched it again recently, and I find it's doing the work of whiteness as well, because it makes all the abolitionists to be hardworking, decent people, when most of them are also racist as well. And I know Carrie's work Carrie Sinanan, who I talked about in the talk, talks about this in the sense that being anti-slavery doesn't make you anti-racist. It just means that you shouldn't be enslaved for your color, but we're still going to hate you for being black. If that makes sense. But yes, I think that whole Wilberforce narrative is deeply embedded in films like Belle, and I think we're still seeing it in different ways in period dramas, that Britain can't get over its idea that we freed the slaves, basically, not that we put them there in the first place. But yeah, I think someone just put a comment in there about Bridgerton.
There are a couple of comments in the chat. Amara has shared a short story by Shani Muti, which deals with ghosts and Caribbean history and just given the reference there. So that's something else for people to follow up. And then Clara has said, in Bridgerton, it's problematic that they are shown drinking tea, eating sugary cakes, wearing beautiful cotton dresses, and it's not addressed how any of these products came to be in England. So yeah, there's a diverse casting, but it doesn't feel progressive if they don't talk about how colonialism and slavery led to the lifestyle that the Bridgerton family and their society enjoy, which I think is really interesting, thinking about kind of some of the nitty gritties of not just where the money comes from, but also how the money is spent. Yeah. Trey, have you got anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's like it's the micro details as well in that. So all the debutante, all the balls and stuff, and the parties and the clothes. There's probably not anywhere within that Empire hasn't touched it in some way. And I know in Jane Austen's work, I think it'll be Love and Friendship, the film. I think this book was called Lady Susan, where it's the 1790s. And at that point, it was cotton was a major import into Britain at that time, and a lot of the clothes that the women would have worn would have been made out of American cotton, which was also picked by enslaved people in the South. So you got that US UK connection there as well. So I think, yeah, it's like once you know what to look for, you start seeing it everywhere, and then you're permanently irritated forever. But yeah, it's not just the big houses, but also the micro details. So what said in the comments, the tea, sugar, coffee, and like chocolate and things like that. You can't watch a Jane Austen film without seeing tea, at least once or twice. So yeah, I think that's when you start being critical. But then you go back to the fandom groups, and they mold the whole personality around it, and then you start seeing the pictures on the plantations and stuff, on the plantation weddings and things like that. So then you start seeing how empire is performed as well. And then you say anything in these groups, you get kicked out. So I was in those groups, and I've been booted out. I think I got booted out of 3. It's for talking about empire and colonialism, because they will use things like no politics rules in these Jane Austen groups, and then if you start talking about things like LGBTQ+, for example, history, which happened when Gentleman Jack came out on the BBC, and people were suddenly become interested in queer histories. People got kicked out over that as well. Anything to do with Black history, saying you want more diversity and representation in British period drama, you get kicked out for that as well. No politics. So that's how they operate. So that's what I'm finding very challenging in these spaces, that we need more of this, but it's almost like you can't talk about it without getting people going from 0 to 100 in a matter of seconds. Yeah, and I think Jane Austen does attract quite a number of like far right people as well within that. And as we know, Trump wouldn't have got in if it wasn't for white women. I think it was 50% of the voter turnout, or 50% of women voted for Trump. White women voted for Trump, and you can sort of see that crossover between white women winning at capitalism in Austen and Trump, and that's sort of like that crossover. And then in Britain, the British side, the culture war as well. So the National Trust report and all those, and Corinne being unfairly targeted by far right people as well in Britain. So yeah, I think it's just a lot. It's a lot of difficult. Everything's a struggle. Everything's a struggle.
For there might be people who are here today who work in kind of heritage sites. They might work in kind of Austen specific heritage sites. They might work in places that have kind of Austen archives associated with them. Like, if someone is having a conversation with a visitor to one of these sites, and they're having a more in-depth conversation, like where is a good starting point for kind of raising some of these more complicated issues about Austen and the relationship with absentee enslavers?
I mean, in terms of empire and stuff like that, I would say I was part of a cluster of journal articles on this. It was myself, Carrie Sinanan, and then Amanda Ray Prescott, who's a journalist in the States as well, and she writes a lot about period dramas. And then also our other friend Bianca Hernandez Knight, who's a historical costumer, and we did a cluster for ABO Journal in the US. It's a women's writing journal, and we did basically Austen on Empire and different aspects of it. And I think I'd say start there, because you get the stretch of it within those papers, and I'll send you the links to that so you can share it amongst colleagues and things like that. But also, I think there's Vanessa Riley has written on this as well. And I'll also say Google search Pineapple Gate as well, because there was a whole scandal in 2019 around Sanditon and using the pineapple fruit as a centerpiece for the dinner party. And the writers used it to commentate on racism. And then obviously, like, as I said before, it attracts quite a number of far-right women, these sorts of programs. And they basically started using the pineapple really inappropriately on social media. And then Amanda wrote a paper on Sanditon and the pineapple. So if you want to look at that as well, it can tell you how Jane Austen is received on social media as well. And you can see the crossovers between Austen and other conversations being had in society, the more popular conversations. But yeah, I'd say start with Carrie Sinanan, Amanda A. Prescott, and Bianca Hernandez Knight, and people like Vanessa Riley as well. I think there's Damian Scott as well. I think I'm trying to find what I put on the slides, because I know I had one slide that had some of the writers on this as well. But there are people writing about it. What I'll say is that a lot of it is American as well. As I said, like Jane Austen to white women is what Churchill is to white men in this country. And I think it's a lot safer to write about this outside of the UK, because you might, if you end up posting about it and you go viral, you're going to get trolled and things like that, and abused by email and stuff like that. So I think the way Austen's received is it's just very it invites a sort of toxic white woman feminine. It's that sort of, it's very like Karen-y in that sense. But
I think that was really helpful at the beginning of today's seminar for you to kind of specifically define what you were meaning by the kind of the Lady Austen's Lady Karens, because I think you're right in saying it, that term has come to be used in a more generic problematic way, but that very specific way in which it is intended to be used, I think was really enlightening. I'm just going to share something in the chat that Andrea has shared with me, which it has some really interesting kind of starting points for conversations around some of these topics. But this is a kind of final call for any other questions that people might have for Trey. So if you have anything that you want to say, now is the time. Amara's also just shared something in the chat. Black Romance podcast has an episode with Vanessa Riley. Thank you so much, Amara. That's really helpful. Trey, I saw something on social media following up from the Instagram post that you shared with the selfie with them taking a photograph of the burning house from the plantation, with people pouring libations on the ground in the area where the plantation was burning. And I just wondered whether this kind of those rituals, whether you've reflected on how ritual might play a part in rethinking country houses and the countryside in Britain as well as in America.
Yeah, I mean, there's diaspora communities in Britain as well. I know in at least the Jamaican contingent that things like that is still popular. And when someone dies, I guess within the Caribbean, I guess broadly speaking, Caribbean community in the UK, there's still ancestral practices like the nine night as well, which is basically a remembrance. I guess 9 days after the person's passed. And I know within my family the libation thing. I think the last person that died was a while ago, but I remember it happening when that happened. So these are things that sort of travelled through the slave trade and empire and sort of got passed down the family tree. But I know in the Caribbean that stuff will be very, very prominent, because I went back to my grandparents' village, and it's like an African village, just in the Caribbean, where everyone looks like you, and it was quite spooky actually, because I've not grown up around most of my family members either. Most of my family members are still like not in the UK, or the past, but a lot of them went back to the Grenada and America and places like that. And we all look the same, and we have the same, like, I guess, dialectal tones as well in some cases, and also I got told that we all walk the same as well. So there's that side of things as well. So I think, like, when you've not grown up around your family, it's quite weird. It's like growing up in bereavement in some aspects. But yeah, those ancestral practices, I think they're still, depending on where you are in the country as well. It depends what's common and what's not. But I know Northampton, nine night is common, because since starting my PhD, I lost 5 participants as well. So 5 people I interviewed have died since October 2022. And I went to the funerals for 3, and there were 9 nights for all of them, I'm sure. And I know the guys in London, who are from South London, that they do that. They're quite, especially the Rastafarians as well. The Rastafarians are very, like, when it comes to stuff like that, they're very much more on it, because that's I guess that's their spiritual beliefs. It goes back to Africa as well, and many of them who are in Northampton went back to Africa. They actually did it, so they're in places like Zimbabwe and Ethiopia, and things like that. But yeah, I think the ancestral practices, I find them really interesting, but again, they've been demonized because of empire, the legacies of empire, and that even goes within the communities themselves. So it's not only a white people thing, but also like the internalized hatred, I'd say, that some Black people can have for themselves, and then it gets projected onto our own cultural practices and things like that, and it leaves some feeling they find their ancestry later on in life because of it. So they've had time to sit on it and reflect, and then they reach 50 and 60, and then they start looking for the cultural aspects of their life that they weren't able to, I guess, contend with when they were younger. But yeah, hopefully I've answered some of that question. Sorry, I went on a little bit there.
No, that's so fascinating, and I just, that is a good way for us to also say good luck to you, Trey, as you kind of finish off your PhD. And I'm sure that there are many people here who are be really interested in reading the PhD when it's finished as well, and the things that you develop out of it. So all that remains really now for me is to say thank you so much to everybody who has come, and thank you so much for all your comments in the chat.